last 2 weeks alone or
That's
something.
right.
So have we ever seen anything else like that with just one election with just two people?
What was amazing to me was, when we talked to operatives on both sides, even in the case of there were three candidates who ran for Senate.
Yeah, Kennedy.
All three sides. And what was amazing to me was that when the poll hit, and it wasn't just our poll. After our poll came out, we were the first, I think.
There was Rasmussen.
Everyone else had Brown
a couple
after
of
we
others,
released our poll. But so much money came into Scott Brown's coffers, they couldn't process the deposits in time to spend it before that Tuesday.
Right.
So they had all of this cash coming in from Friday through Monday, couldn't process it in time to even spend it, and so he got the best of both worlds. He got elected, and his campaign coffers were filled with millions of dollars.
Right.
Because he just hit it right that weekend before the election.
And another Suffolk connection there, Rob Willington was one of the ones, I think they got, 90% of all their donations came in online?
That's right.
And like 75% were from out of state?
That's right.
So let's now move to the upcoming November elections, and let's see, can we extrapolate? Everybody's talking about the Brown effect, and we just talked about how unique of an election that was.
Right.
How much carryover do you see, and does the polling data you've done so far indicate that?
Well, I mean, there are two ways to look at the Brown victory. Number one, it was a sort of foreshadowing of a repeat performance by a Republican candidate or an anti-democratic candidate.
Anti-incumbent candidate.
That's one side. The other side is it was a lesson for Democrats and Democratic candidates to learn so that it doesn't happen again.
Sure.
It becomes something that you look back to when you say, well, you don't want a Brown effect to happen.
Right.
Now, which dynamic will prevail has a lot to do with the job situation, what the unemployment rate is, not only statewide, nationally, but within one's municipality.
Sure, locally.
And any corruption trials that might come out in the fall, and whether there'll be a connection.
Right, any other scandals that pop up between now and then?
And whether or not voters will be polarized by one or both of the major candidates challenging Deval Patrick.
Right.
The polling suggests that Deval Patrick is getting anywhere between core 38 and 42%, which is good enough to win in a competitive three-way fight.
Sure.
42 wins. 42 isn't the majority, but 42 could win.
If Cahill stays where he is and Baker stays where he is.
Right. And the theory is what happens to Tim Cahill if he starts in the mid-teens, spends $3 million, does he drop to single digits? Does he improve into the 20s? And does that help Deval Patrick or Charlie Baker? So those are the dynamics we'll be measuring very carefully, yes.
And one of the other things, though, is when we talked about where Scott Brown was one singularity that happened on one given day. Now we're talking about, you got races for governor. All of a sudden there are races for congressional seats that you never have seen before. At least you haven't seen in a dozen years or something. There's a very large turnover in the legislature between people retiring and running for different seats.
Right.
How do you think that's all shaken out now, and how are those interplays going to happen? And is that tracked on a poll?
Well, I think when you have two choices this fall, it'll be much better if you're a challenger.
Okay.
But because you've had such a large amount of candidates coming out and running, some have chosen to run as an independent, and that works against the Republican Party in most cases where there's a Democratic incumbent.
Yep.
In races where it's D versus R and it's a Democratic incumbent, I think it strongly helps the challenger.
Sure.
But in races for Congress or other offices where you might have 3 or 4 or 5 candidates running, some being independents, you've got that anti-vote being split up. Witness the governor's race here. Yeah,
and we've seen that a lot around the country now with these Tea Party candidates really going in and fracturing the base.
Right.
So where are you left right there? And I think that's one of the things happening, as you just explained, with governor.
Right.
So, normally I think if it was Baker versus Patrick, I think Baker would probably win easily. But with Tim Cahill in the race, I don't know now.
Right. I mean, it follows the same model, I think, of New Jersey in a way, because in New Jersey there was the Democrat and Republican, there was Chris Daggett, who was an independent, and then there were 7 other independents. And when Daggett went up in numbers, the independent, Corzine, the Democrat, went up also.
Right.
And I think you'll see the same thing as Cahill goes up. I think Patrick's lead will increase.
Sure.
If Cahill drops like Daggett dropped at the end, and Corzine lost.
Right.
And Christie won that, the Republican, I think directly because of the drop in Daggett at the end.
Right.
So it puts a lot of pressure on operatives.
It does.
For that last 72-hour period when the whole
to get the vote out.
Wholesale shifts in public. Because
sure.
if there are people, and there are some, who will not vote for Deval Patrick no matter what, they need to be watching the polls to find out who the real viable alternative candidate is. Now, we all assume it's Baker. It could end up Baker. But, Tim Cahill has $3 million to spend.
Right.
And we don't know whether or not the message
he's going to be able to convince them, I can win.
Will have traction. That's
because I really think that's what happened with Scott Brown. All of a sudden people said, well, maybe he can win, so I will throw my vote to him.
Right. And one of the questions we asked in the polling was, will you vote for Scott Brown? This was in an older poll that was done back before the primary, and when Martha Coakley was leading Brown by 30 points.
Right.
So this was before the primary. And one of the questions was, would you vote for Scott Brown? They would say no. What about your neighbors? And there was a vast difference. There was a vast difference in terms of what people were willing to do individually, but whether or not they thought other people would also vote the same way they would vote.
Right.
And that changed as Brown, then people saying, I'm voting for Brown, but maybe other people will vote for him too.
Sure.
And that changed the dynamic.
And there's really so many other things at play here because, if there is a local race that is as particularly compelling, like all of a sudden now there's a race for state rep, a race for state senate, a race for county commissioner, a race for Congress.
Right.
So that particular area may have a very strong turnout.
That's right.
As opposed to an area that doesn't have as many races. But it seems like there's more races this year across the board.
More contested races. I think the primary will be quiet, though. I think the primary on September 14th will be quiet,
relatively,
except in some pockets. Maybe the Braintree area for Suzanne Bump, and the Worcester area for Guy Glotis, and Brookline and Newton, and some of the other areas for Steve Grossman, Boston for Steve Murphy. But outside of that, where there aren't contested primaries, and there are a number of unopposed candidates in the primaries, you might see a light turnout.
Now, let's just one more thing about the statewide, and particularly about the governor's race here, because I think one of the interesting dynamics is now that there are three. How many other times have there been three where you've had, because I would imagine that changes the polling data quite a bit and the manner with which you construct the poll and things like that. Can you go over that a little? I mean, I remember back in '06 with Kerry Healy, Christy Myhouse, and Deval Patrick, a lot of people really indicated that Christy Myhouse turned out to be at least a factor in that race. Maybe not the true spoiler, but at least he was a factor in that race. Do you see the same this time, or do you see Cahill really being a spoiler?
I mean, he is a factor now because he's in the mid-teens and he has a lot of money to spend. I think you've got to go back to 1932, prior to Myhouse.
Right.
You have to go back to 1932.
Right.
When a candidate named Goodwin got 6 3/4% of the vote as an independent.
Right.
Frank Goodwin in 1932.
Close to 80 years ago.
And Christy Myhouse, some people took him seriously, some people didn't. He now holds the record today for the most votes received by an independent candidate for governor. That will be broken by Tim Cahill, I believe.
You're convinced of that?
I think he'll get more than 7% of the vote. I mean, he's been a elected state treasurer twice.
Yeah. And where he's polling right now, he would have to really drop off.
Right. He's got a strong base in Norfolk County and the Quincy area, and then he has pockets of support in the southeastern Mass and in western Mass. So I think it's unlikely that Tim Cahill will be less of a factor than Christy Myhouse was in '06.
Right.
Question is, will it be high enough to help Deval Patrick or not? Could Tim Cahill get 12, 15% if he doesn't take off this fall and get really competitive and still, be a spoiler or not?
Now, one question about the polls themselves. How much beforehand do you have to project the vote to be able to say, okay, well, this is what we're going to base the poll on, this level of turnout?
Yeah, it's called the sample frame, and it takes a lot of research. It takes research by going back to like elections. So we
Sure.
would go back to '06 and '02,
Mhm.
not '08. And we also construct county by county quotas where the turnout will be exactly proportionate to the registered voters. I don't want to confuse the
Sure, sure.
viewers, but exactly proportionate to the makeup of the registered voters in each of those counties. And then add a second layer of what the intensity is today.
The trends
in
going
terms
that
of,
way.
is there an unusually high demographic that's saying they're absolutely certain that they're voting, and what is that telling us in terms of Democrat versus Republican or independent?
Now, is that going to really impact the next poll that you're doing, what, probably within the next few weeks you'll probably be doing one?
Yes.
And if so, how much will we be able to hang our hat on that? Like you go into the plus or minus and the margin of error and things like that. What can we expect out of this next poll?
Well, most polls carry a plus or minus of 4 or 5%, and ours will. I expect it will release a poll sometime after the primary in late September. And I think that there's a 95% probability that the poll results will be
accurate.
Plus or minus 5% of any finding that we report. Now, you know, in terms of the accuracy of November, you know, obviously we want to try and be as close as we can to the actual outcome, and that's where the bellwether testing gives us the added edge, I think.
Okay. Well, we're getting ready to wrap up here, but before we do, I want to see if we can get some predictions out of you.
Oh, no.
A couple different we will stay away from the race for governor. Let's go maybe some of the ballot questions. Are they going to vote to repeal the sales tax?
You know, both repeal questions were close, and the textbook says that that probably will favor the no side as people begin to find the devil in the details. But I think with the economy potentially hitting a double dip, we'll see where the ad campaigns come down with it. People might be, you know, in the mindset of, you know, can't afford it, you know, and let the legislature solve the problem.
Right, okay, all right. Well, Dave, we want to thank you for coming on.
My pleasure.
We've had David Paleologis, the director of the Political Research Center at Suffolk University, so we want to thank him for coming on. Look forward to a great election season. We've got another couple of shows coming up here over the next coming months, so stay tuned. We want to thank you for tuning in. I'm David D'Arcangelo, your host, and we'll see you next time on Around Town.